It's all about grace. This morning I'm going to take both as a subject and as our text for this sermon, the word and the grand reality encompassed by that marvelous word, grace. And I do so because Jim Lewis directed me to do so. Because you see, he paid good money for this. We post each year a sermon topic to buy for Go and Serve to send the young people off on their mission trips, and Jim happened to purchase it this year and on the bid board, and so we will have a sermon on grace. And I will tell you it will be by God's Holy Spirit as to whether it is profound and wide and high, equal to the payment that was given for it. So we had lunch on Thursday, and he was gracious enough to pay for lunch. So during our lunch, we talked about this question concerning grace, and his expressed desire to me that it should be a sermon on a practical application of grace. And so I will be providing several illustrations of grace this morning that I hope will be helpful. The first thing you need to know is that there are two kinds of grace. There is divine grace and there is human grace. And the scriptures, both Old and New Testament, are full of numerous examples of what this grace means. Too often, we Christians, do this false dichotomy between the Old and New Testaments on this subject. We juxtapose law and grace in a way that is both harmful to both communities. The reality is that from the Jewish perspective, law is a grace. Now, in case you don't understand that, I want you to think for just a moment about trying to raise a 2-year-old who is absolutely sure that he or she runs the universe and does so with great authority and great chaos. And unless you impose law on the little booger, things are not going to be gracious or graceful in your life. Do you get it? Get the picture? Law is grace. So when Paul speaks about that, you need to remember that. These are not false dichotomies. They are part of a continuum of grace. The first divine grace the Bible speaks about means unexpected, unlimited mercy, unmerited love, and undeserved favor given to us freely by God. The second, human grace, means everyday garden variety acts of graciousness that flow from that divine grace, grows out of a universal human desire to treat others as we would want to be treated. It's simply like that. These two are not exclusive of one another, but are actually interrelated to each other. And for purposes of our sermon today, we're going to see both the differences and the similarities. And one of the most unusual of God's pure, free graces was his election of Israel as God's chosen people. Now just think about this for a moment. Of all the nations and tribes and people in the world that God could have chosen, he chose the Jews. It's unmistakable. The scriptures are clear. And my rabbi friends will tell you there is no particular reason for God doing that. For God is, after all, the God of all the children of the earth. But God chose our Jewish friends in order to bring a particular revelation into the world and to grace the world with that particular revelation. Are you hearing me? God showed graciousness in the midst of that. At one time, if you read the story in 1 Samuel, when the Ark of the Covenant, which held the Ten Commandments, got captured by the Philistines and inflicted some boils and diseases upon them, and they decided, well, let's get rid of this god. And so they send off the Ark of the Covenant to wander, and the people in one part of Israel hear the cattle lowing as the oxen bring the Ark of the Covenant into their village. And the people of Kiriath Jearim and the household of Abinadab particularly bring the Ark of the Covenant in, and the end result of their providing hospitality for the Ark of the Covenant is that they are deeply blessed. This was a gracious act of hospitality, and there are hundreds of those examples in both the Old and New Testament. I know sometimes it has made you uncomfortable for me to speak in a very personal vein about my own life, but I'm going to do so again today because some of you have asked me to speak about my father. And before I do, this being Father's Day, I want to quote Tom Wolfe from The Bonfire of the Vanities. He says in that wonderful novel, Sherman made the terrible discovery that men make about their fathers, sooner or later, that the man before him was not an aging father, but really a little boy. A boy much like himself. A boy who grew up and had a child of his own, and as best he could, out of a sense of duty and perhaps love, adopted a role called being a father, so that his child would have something mythical and infinitely important, a protector who would keep a lid on all the chaotic and catastrophic possibilities of life. The problem was, at least in the early days, my father was not a protector. Some of you have heard bits and pieces, but the fact of the matter is my father was an alcoholic. And as often in the case with some alcoholics, if they have children, they sometimes choose one of them for the object of their anger and their distresses towards the world. And I was that child. I have distinct, horrible memories of my early childhood, including one night when my drunken father came home on Saturday night, took out the razor that he used to shave his face clean, he was cleanly shaven, and tried to cut my hair with it. And what it ended up doing was cutting and bringing out huge gobs of hair, pulled directly by the roots out of my head. I like to think that's why I'm bald. And there were other such incidents. And my mother in her wisdom decided that I should go and live with her parents. And you've heard many, many wonderful stories about my maternal grandparents. And that was a great grace. To grow up in that wonderful household with those two elderly people. But for whatever reason, God took my mother when I was 12, and the wisdom of Nebraska's courts sent me back home to live with him. Yep, that's how it works sometimes, people. And it wasn't any better. But in the midst of that, I began to realize that perhaps the death of my mother was what C.S. Lewis calls a severe mercy. Because curiously, he began to be better. He had continuous relapses, but there were shining moments. And I want you to hear that too, because somewhere God gave me from His Spirit the ability to even then see that what was happening to me was not my dad, but the drink. That it wasn't about him or me, but about it. And there were wonderful moments with him, for he taught me how to hunt and how to fish And he was patient and gracious enough to help me learn how to drive a car with a clutch as he went jerka, jerka, jerka around the countryside. And he loved to read. And he introduced me to Dickens and the great English authors. And so you knew from the very get-go that there was something in there. And then his life was graced by another woman who became my stepmother. And was she ever a gem? And a grace for all of us. And I watched my father getting better. But one of the things he never was sure about was religion. His religion, truthfully, was in one of the local beer joints on Saturday night getting good and verschnooken. And so my life early on happened between Saturday nights in a local beer joint, and I call beer joints because they really weren't restaurants and they really weren't anything fancy at all. And the next morning being in the Presbyterian church, scrubbed clean and singing hymns. Well, you can see which took. You will have to decide whether that's a grace or not. And my father didn't like church much. In fact, he really hated church. And so when I told him that I was going to be a pastor, it was not met with the same joy and acclaim and love that it did when I told my grandmother, but rather with anger and rage. For preachers were among the worthless creatures of the earth. Well, to make a long story short, I went off to seminary. There were moments of continued alienation. In my final year at seminary, my stepmother called me and said, Billy, you have to come home. Your father is dying of cirrhosis of the liver. We don't know how long he's going to live. So, in the middle of January snowstorm, I flew back to Nebraska, fulfilling the law. For there was no graciousness about my going home. It was honoring my father and mother to fulfill the law. And after a horrendous trip back to Nebraska and driving snowstorms, both by plane and car, I ended up in South Dakota, walked into his room, his hospital room where he lay dying, or so we thought at the time. And he turned and took one look at me, turned back against the wall, and said, I had hoped it was your brother coming. Well, it was true. My big brother was always his favorite. And I let him know that all the time. But as I was growing up, and I want you to hear this too, there were countless wonderful men who came into my life. My uncles, his brothers were just incredible people for us children. My mother's brothers were incredible people. Teachers and pastors and coaches and band directors and all these wonderful people were great graces given to all of us. Do you hear that? It makes a difference in life, a huge difference. And that's why you hear me so often urging you to be those kind of people in our community, to be those gifts and graces from God to the community. Well, the year I was ordained, Dad came to church. Oh, if you don't believe in miracles, you know, that was the day. And as I stepped up to the communion table to offer communion for the first time, with enormous joy in my heart, I looked over and there was my father beaming. And then when we distributed communion, he did something I had never seen him do in his entire life. He received the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. And after the service was over, my dad came up to me, and in such an unexpected way, he did something he had never done before. He said, "Billy, I'm proud of you, and I want you to know that I was wrong, and I'm sorry for everything. Will you forgive me?" Ah. All those scenes, all those horrendous scenes. And I turned to him and said, "Dad, why did you receive communion today?" "Well, Billy, that's another story. I've waited much too long and have been too far away far too long." A couple of weeks later, he was gone. At least gone from this earth. And during my recent illness, I have a very rich dream life. I was telling Jim about this marvelous dream I had of my father, and we were standing on a creek bed, a Nebraska creek bed, and he's fishing. I've seen him standing over there. And the thought comes to my mind, because this is not Nebraska, it really is heaven. You can tell by the dream that this is a heavenly place. It's something about heaven that can look a little like Nebraska, but so much more, okay? Got the drift? And the moment I thought in my dream, "How did you get here?" he turns in the dream and says to me, "Billy, it's all about grace here." And Jesus came to show us that through law and the love of God and the forgiveness of God, that the whole intent of Yahweh was love and forgiveness and grace incarnate in this rabbi, this son of Israel, this son of God, that we might see what the life of grace looked like in a human being. It's all about grace, there and here. And I pray we have not only men who understand that, but women too. Amen.